Welcome. In this demo, we are going to show integration between HTML5 and Java EE7, specifically JSF 2.2 with HTML5 friendly markup and Websocket. So NetBeans comes with a bunch of sample projects that we can use as a base for our own projects, and there's a WebSocket sample that is very useful for our purposes, so we're going to use that as a base for the demo. So let's go ahead and run the sample application. Okay, browser will be coming up in a minute. For those of you that don't know, um, WebSocket allows two-way communication between the browser and the server, where with traditional HTTP um, communication, the browser has to make a request and the server sends a response. That is not necessarily the case with WebSocket. With WebSocket, the server can send messages to the browser without having to wait for a request. Now, our application is coming up. Uh, this is the sample application. It sends a message to the WebSocket endpoint and then receives the same message back from the endpoint. So let's take a look at the Java source code real quick. To develop a WebSocket endpoint, uh, one way we can do it is by using the server endpoint annotation. And if we annotate a method with the onMessage annotation, then this will process messages received from the browser. In this simple example, all it does is send the message back, just like we saw when I was showing how the application works. So let's take a look at the HTML. So you guys can see there's a lot of JavaScript. Okay, here's the markup for the button. When the button is clicked, the sendEcho JavaScript function is invoked, and what this does is bind some JavaScript functions to WebSocket events. So let's go ahead and add a JSF page. So let's add the JSF framework to the application. This creates an index.xhtml file. This is a faceless file using JSF specific tags. However, we want to use standard HTML that can be previewed on the browser without having to deploy it. So for that, we need to get rid of this H namespace and add a JSF namespace. So now the JSF specific tags are not valid anymore, so let's get rid of them. Now, if we want the JSF API to process the HTML tags, we need to add JSF specific attributes, and these attributes are provided by this namespace right here. So let's add an ID. Okay, so now let's add a form, standard HTML form. NetBeans has this handy palette that we can just drag and drop, and it generates the markup for us. Okay, so again, if we want JSF to process it, we need a JSF specific attribute. So let's add prepend ID equals false. Now our markup is going to be very simple. We're going to be focusing on the back end, so we're not going to make a very pretty page here. And also we're not CSS snobs, so we're gonna use a table to lay out our form. So I want a border of 0, and I want 3 columns, and the rest looks fine. Okay, so let's get rid of the table header. We don't need it. Now let's add a couple of labels. And let's drag a text input. This looks good. Now since we want JSF to process this, we need to use the JSF value attribute, and let's give it an ID. Now let's copy this whole thing and paste it here. This one is going to be last name. Now we want to bind this to a CDI name bean, so we don't have one yet, so let's add one. I call it person. Okay. And let's add a couple of attributes. And let's generate some headers and setters. Getters and setters. Okay, now this is a CDI name bean. We want it to be request scoped. So for that we can use the CDI model annotation that is equivalent to saying that is at named and at request scoped. Okay, so now that we have our CDI name bean, let's go back to our markup. And here we can use expression language to bind this to properties in our person class. Okay, so let's add a submit button. And again, we need a JSF specific attribute. Those of you that are familiar with JSF will know that this will navigate to a page called confirmation.xhtml. Now we don't have one, so let's go ahead and create it. And our confirmation page is going to be very simple. All we're going to do is output the first name and last name from the person being. Okay, so let's go back to the browser and test this. Okay, so as we can see, we have our JSF using HTML5 friendly markup, and the CDI name bean is getting populated properly. So far so good, but all we have at this point is JSF with HTML friendly markup. So let's go ahead and add Websocket, and I'm just gonna go ahead and copy all this JavaScript. And in a real application, we would probably put this in some JS file, but for demo purposes, just copying and pasting will work. Okay, let's place it on the head. Now, notice that this script loads or invokes an init method, init JavaScript function when the page loads, and what this does is set a JavaScript variable to a div with ID of output that we don't have. So let's go ahead and copy it as well. You can put it right here under the table. Okay, whoops. Now, let's see if we can reload this so that otherwise we'll just close the browser and run it later. So let's add a button right above the table will work. In this case, a standard button. What we plan to do is invoke the WebSocket endpoint and get some default values to populate the form. So okay, the doSend method just sends a message to the WebSocket endpoint right here. Actually, before moving on, the send echo, recall from the previous page that we saw, the generated page, that this binds the JavaScript functions to WebSocket events, and it does that every time the button is clicked. So instead of doing that, let's just do that once on page load. So let's move this to init, and now we can get rid of send echo. Okay, let's run the application. Browser will come up momentarily. And that way we can see what we have so far. We're not done yet. Okay, it's coming up. Let's click on get defaults, and we're still, the server endpoint is still echoing what we're sending to it, but so far so good. Let's modify the Java code for the endpoint. We're going to make a simple change here. We want to return a JSON string. So format the code. And in a real application, we will probably use JSONP, the Java API for JSON processing. But for this demo purposes, we're just going to hardcode some JSON and return that. Okay, see if we can reload. Okay, and the JSON looks correct. So far we're just debugging, so now we need to add some JavaScript to populate these fields with the JSON, with the values from the JSON string. So on message, let's add some JavaScript here. Okay, let's go back to the browser, click on get defaults, and we got our fields populated. If we click submit, we can see that the CDI name bean was populated with the values that we retrieved from JSON. So that's it for this demo. Hope you guys found it informative. If you want more information on Java EE 7, please check out my book coming out soon. It covers Java EE 7 and Glassfish.